Toronto was a founding board member. I became the chair when Mayor Livingston was defeated. I was elected the chair. And I had the opportunity to see what a number of cities around the world, 20 in the developed world and 20 in the developing world, were doing on environmental issues from a perspective of social justice and jobs. So my remarks tonight will reflect that knowledge as well. And I have to say that from my perspective, it was an extremely sad day for Canada when Stephen Harper took Canada out of the Kyoto Accord. And you can see that the federal government was embarrassed to do it because they did it in the sneakiest way possible. But the good news is that there are still initiatives around the world, even in countries like Canada, that taken together can make a huge difference. The challenge for us, I think, is how quickly we act. And, okay, can somebody tell me how to advance the slide? So, the environment is an issue of social justice. And I may not need to convince people in this room about it, but it's very clear. You only have to look at Hurricane Sandy in New York City to see the results. And people in lower income neighborhoods often tend to be lower lying neighborhoods. There's a neighborhood in New York City where the sewers are still made out of wood. They haven't been renewed since the 1800s. And you can imagine what happened to those neighborhoods with infrastructure that's literally 150 years old when Sandy hit. And they tend, of course, to be lower income neighborhoods. So even within a developed country like the United States or Canada, there's an unequal impact of the changing climate. And it's incumbent upon us to act immediately, to fight climate change, and of course to adapt to it as well. We don't see this just in Sandy. We see it in developing cities. This is Jakarta. Last week. That is downtown Jakarta last week. That's like having a boat on Yonge Street. And you can imagine how long it's going to take Jakarta to recover. The richest city in the world, New York City, the heart of the international financial capital system, is still recovering from Sandy. Jakarta. And I could have had slides here from all around the world. This is happening today. This is not what might happen when temperature increases over the next decades. This is what's happening today. And the cost in human lives and infrastructure is incredible. In Toronto's case, one program to deal with rainfall, the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan, which is an awful name because you can't say it in speeches. But it's a program to rebuild sewers and use natural systems to deal with rainwater. Partly because of the increasing number of storms. That one program is costing $1 billion. And to give you some sense of what that means, the City of Toronto takes in about $3.5 billion in taxes in a given year. So that would be the equivalent of a federal program that costs $35 or $40 million. Like buying warplanes that you don't need. But that's not the topic of tonight's lecture. So this is even happening in Toronto. And there are differential impacts here. In my second term as mayor, 4 years, we had 3 storms, each one of which should only happen once in 50 years. And the infrastructure is built for those 50-year storms. And there was hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to city infrastructure and people's private property during those storms. Very, very serious challenges to the city. So cities around the world, led by activist mayors, are showing the world that they're not going to wait for governments like Stephen Harper's to get into Kyoto and act. The cities are going to act within their capacity now. And they're doing it for a couple of reasons. They're doing it for moral and ethical reasons, but they're also doing it for practical reasons. Because it's in cities you see the cost of climate change, as you saw from those slides. That's where the damage is happening. And the good news, if you take the C40 as an example, the good news is we can actually act quickly to surmount these challenges. The C40 population within the regional areas of those cities is over 600 million people. Huge population. It was one country that would be the most powerful and rich country in the world if it was a developed country. Massive. Calculating the greenhouse gases from those cities, if you use the activities happening in the cities and the energy required to support those activities, it's about 80% of the greenhouse gases in the world, and about 75% of the world's economy is from urban areas as a whole, not just the C40 cities. So it's in cities we can find solutions, and if we find solutions that are just and equitable, and also create jobs, and our environmental solutions, we can solve these challenges. And that's why President Bill Clinton said cities are showing the world how. And he said that in Seoul in 2009. I was the chair of the C40. We had a press conference, and I have to tell you about it because it was a marvelous moment. I'd never seen anything like this. And as mayor of Toronto, you're often in the eye of the storm if there's a significant issue. And I've had some pretty heated media conferences. Well, President Clinton and I are in a room about this size, actually, and we're at that end on a podium speaking, and there's about 6 rows of print media sitting in front of them. So to about where the end of that radiator is, the first one. And then the entire rest of the room was television cameras. It was even more television cameras than when the Leafs win a game. It was the most extraordinary thing I've seen, and there were television cameras from every network, major network in the world, the BBC, CNN, Japan's national broadcaster, China, everywhere in the world, except Canada. And there was no Canadian print reporter. So my hard-working communications staff said, we'll solve the problem. We'll send a picture of you and President Clinton to the Toronto Star. It's the largest daily circulation paper in Canada, and surely it's interested about the mayor of Toronto leading an international organization making a major announcement on climate change with former President Bill Clinton. So he was right, they ran the photograph, except they cut Bill Clinton out of the photograph. At the time I was training for a marathon, and when I was first elected mayor I was not fit, and I had quarter pounders with cheese several days a week, and I was really large. And at this point in time I was really skinny. So the Star cut Bill Clinton out of the photograph and put a photograph of the skinny David Miller beside the fat David Miller on the front page and said, see how much weight David Miller has lost, shown speaking here in Seoul. So it has nothing to do with climate change, but the lesson is don't try to tell the media their job or you'll get in trouble. So anyway, Bill Clinton, and he's right, says cities are showing the world how. So what are they doing? Well, cities are taking quite significant action to fight climate change, create jobs. Here's an example, Sao Paulo. They developed a new technology with the support of the World Bank. It's common to capture methane gas from landfill. What's different about this is the magnitude of the landfill. It's South America's largest landfill. I'm told that it's like all of downtown Toronto, one landfill. It's really massive and huge. And it was a new technology developed specifically in Brazil that was extremely clean, burns the methane with very low, if any, emissions. And methane is a really hazardous greenhouse gas. So it's taking the greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere, lowering greenhouse gases significantly, and in a heavy industrial city, creating a significant portion of their electricity. And the interesting thing about cities is we learn from each other. So when I found out Sao Paulo was doing this, I asked our waste management team, what are we doing in Toronto? And they said, well, we're already turning methane into gas from our closed landfill, Mr. Mayor. And I said, well, what are we doing in our open landfill? And that turned into a project to take the methane gas about 1 kilometer to a nearby farm, where it's used again to generate electricity. It creates jobs, as it did in Sao Paulo, good technical technicians' jobs inside the electricity plant. It sells electricity back into the grid with a feed-in tariff in Ontario, so the city's going to make a little bit of money from it, which is a good thing. But it uses the waste heat to heat industrial-sized greenhouses at this farm and grow food. So from Toronto's garbage, we're powering, well, London, Ontario region, growing food and creating jobs. And we learned that from Sao Paulo. And other cities will learn from us and do more. Los Angeles, we took this idea from Toronto, but we're Canadian, we're very prudent. We did a pilot project to test if you could use LED bulbs in your street lights. It's more complicated than it sounds, because you have to have enough light to be safe for people to walk and drive. While we were doing our pilot project, LA said, that's a great idea. And they replaced all of their street lights. Saved money, created some opportunities for local entrepreneurs. Calgary, in the heart of the oil patch, the head offices of all the Canadian oil companies, including the ones that deny that climate change is a problem. and including the ones that obfuscate and the ones that want to build pipelines for environmentally sensitive areas. All of them. Calgary, all of the municipal electricity used to power the city's activities. Not the whole city, but the city's activities. The water pumps, the water system, Parks and Rec, and of course the LRT, is all from wind by the end of last year. A really extraordinary thing undertaken by former Mayor David Bronconier. And it shows you can do it. If you can do that in Calgary, you can do it in a lot of cities around the world. Copenhagen's taking this much further. As Denmark's whole industrial strategy is around green industries, as you probably know. We were in Copenhagen in 2009 as the C40 mayors. We had almost all of the C40 mayors, including mayors like Mayor Michael Bloomberg from New York, who succeeded me as chair, and another 40 mayors from around the world. And we made a huge impact on the climate talks, which unfortunately did not go nearly far enough. But during it, we were taken out to the harbor to tour this wind farm. And I found it fascinating. So there's a private wind farm and a co-op. And the head of the co-op was the one who took us on this boat tour. And he told us that people in Denmark absolutely loved this co-op wind farm. They thought it was terrific. And he said he'll get calls from people, sort of 10 o'clock at night. Hello, Eric, it's Lars here. Have you greased turbine 23 this month? It's turning slower than turbine 24. And people were very, very engaged. And they understood the connection between green energy, jobs, their future opportunities for their children and grandchildren. And one of the fabulous things about Copenhagen is they've taken what other cities are doing further. And I'll talk about Toronto's strategies in a minute. But all of the C40 cities have a climate change strategy. They've all said we have to address climate change. Most of them have connected it to jobs as well. Some of them have connected it to social justice. Copenhagen has one strategy. It's the green economic strategy. And it addresses climate change and how you're going to do it and how you're going to green the economy all at the same time, and they're acting on it. This isn't just a law that's been passed or a policy document. They act on it every day. Extremely impressive and a great model for other cities around the world that are starting to pick up on. So in Toronto, we had a number of strategies, and what I want to talk about is give you a little bit of background, and then talk about a couple of examples in particular where we were able to bring together the ideas of social justice, jobs, and the environment. Because the world I want to live in and the city I want to live in has to address all three. We have to address our environmental challenges, or there are going to be very significant changes, and they're going to have a huge impact on impoverished people around the world. We have to address our economic challenges, and if we don't do that in a way that creates social justice, I think, first of all, it's wrong, but secondly, we'll have equally significant challenges as people who are being taken advantage of and are disempowered decide to try and gain power to have a fair shake. So what do we do in Toronto? Well, we have a climate change strategy called Changes in the Air. That passed City Council unanimously, including everybody who is elected today who was elected then. All of them. They all voted for our climate change strategy. And the strategy has very aggressive targets. We adopted Kyoto targets in the outgoing years, stronger targets, very aggressive measures, including approving in concept the Transit City Plan, very aggressive measures to achieve them. And every single member of council showed up for the vote, and I'll tell you why in a second, and it was unanimous, and all the people who got re-elected voted for it. And I think that's because Torontonians had an expectation that their city would show leadership and would act on the issue of climate change. There's no way to get a unanimous vote in municipal government otherwise, because there's no parties. There's no party whip. You can't force people to vote. You can only ask for their support, and they'll support you if they've got the same philosophy or if they believe their constituents support the initiative. And that's what happened here. And I know everybody was in their seats, because just after this there was a vote on something called the land transfer tax, which was slightly more controversial, but equally essential if you want to finance a city government that actually has the capacity to invest to meet people's needs. And I think we're very lucky that it was passed and it's still sustained in the city budget today. So in Changes in the Air, we specifically contemplated an economic development strategy for Toronto that would create jobs through environmental initiatives, and by supporting, for example, industries that you use applied thinking, very loosely and I think incorrectly called creative industries. That strategy came out in 2008, and then we had to tackle the hard part of how do you meet these targets. We said we want to meet Kyoto. Now, the press keeps saying, well, it was a good thing that the Canadian government got out of Kyoto. It's only realistic. We can't meet our targets, so don't worry about it. That's absolutely false. And we can meet our targets, and we can meet them because we know the majority of greenhouse gases are either in cities or for the activities that support them, and that's where the economy is. And this strategy shows exactly how. And it was written by the City of Toronto and Toronto Hydro, and it identified specific measures through changing the way we create our power, how we distribute it, and how we view buildings to actually meet the Kyoto targets in the City of Toronto as a geographic area on the schedule set out in the Kyoto Protocol. And the important things to think about in that strategy are energy conservation, demand management, and distributed energy through a smart grid. So, for example, the city passed a bylaw saying if you want to put small-scale solar or wind on the roof of your house or small commercial building, you can do it as of right. You don't need special permission to do it. And the Toronto electricity grid, with some technological support, and it needs rebuilding anyway, so we might as well rebuild it to the state-of-the-art smart grid, would be able to accommodate distributed energy in that way through green sources, like small-scale wind, solar, and ground-source heat pumps, geothermal, which is economic to do in Toronto today. The strategy explicitly sets out a way to meet the Kyoto targets, and we knew we could, and work started on that. Now, there's some challenges because the province runs the energy industry and regulates it, but within what the city could do, this plan, and it can be used in any major city, a similar plan in the world that's powered through electricity. This plan shows how to meet the Kyoto targets. So, in changes in the air, we have a whole range of initiatives. So one of the things I want to talk about, so it's really important from a social justice perspective, is engaging citizens and community. And I knew, and we knew at council because of the unanimous vote, and I knew because people would stop me in the street and talk about it all the time, that there was a tremendous interest in environmental issues in Toronto between 2006 and 2010, and I think it's building on a great foundation. This city's always been environmentalists. We've had a great history. People like Jack Layton have done tremendous work at the municipal level on environmental issues for decades. But there was a real interest, and part of it was because in Christmas in 2006, there was no snow. And Al Gore happened to come out with an inconvenient truth at the same time. And the penny dropped. And people said, yeah, of course, we do face a real risk. What are you doing? And they expected their leaders to act. But people used to stop me in the street all the time and say, I want to do something, but what can I do? I don't know what to do. I use my green bin, but I don't know what to do. What else can I do? And we realized that one of the things we need to do was actually go out and talk to people and support them and educate them and help them with knowledge so they could choose in their own lives and with their neighborhoods and in their communities to act. And we created a program called Live Green Toronto. This slide shows all of the various things the city was doing to address carbon reduction and create jobs. And I'll speak about a couple more, but I want to speak about the civic engagement first. Live Green Toronto was a program funded to about $20 million, and the idea was we hired people to actually go out in the community, they were called community animators, and work with people in neighborhoods. And we targeted them to lower income neighborhoods. And in addition to that, we gave small grants that people could access, usually collectively in a neighborhood initiative, but sometimes individually, in order to do programs that met our environmental goals, and typically would also involve some employment and a social justice aspect. And why did we work in lower income neighborhoods predominantly? Well, for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that in Toronto's case, people who live in low income neighborhoods typically are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs. That's how they make a living. And the challenge, if you're working 2 or 3 part-time jobs, and students here, I'm sure, face similar challenges in trying to be a student and trying to work and pay for their tuition and pay for rent and entertainment, is you have no time left for other things. And if you're working 2 or 3 part-time jobs and you have to commute in a city that doesn't have a rapid transit network that reaches every neighborhood, you've got an even bigger problem. And so we knew it was extremely important to start with the people who are most disadvantaged in Toronto and help them achieve their goals and their community goals first. And that's how Live Green Toronto works. So the animators would go to communities, work with people, help them on their programs and projects, and it's important. You know, if you're living in a small apartment in Toronto today, it may well be that your electricity costs for heating are extremely high and out of proportion to your rent, and start to make things unaffordable. So if you're able to do with your landlord, or if you're in a co-op with your co-op, if you're able to do some work on an energy retrofit, for example, or if you're able to put a small-scale solar project that helps offset the cost of electricity by selling back into the grid, can make a very real difference to your financial life, not just your environmental life. And that's what Live Green Toronto did. It was a very, very important aspect, I think, to sit down with people in their own neighborhoods and talk to them, and more importantly, listen to them. And the philosophy of this was similar to a program in my first term as mayor called Listening to Toronto, where when we prepared the budget, we didn't just prepare it at City Hall, we actually went out to neighborhoods and communities and had facilitated sessions where people got the information about the proposed budget, and then they weighed in and gave their opinions. And, you know, obviously, in a big session with 100 people, not everybody's going to change a line of the budget, but what we did was we clumped together the key themes and talked about those. And people got a very direct say, much more than a 5-minute deputation at City Hall. A very important principle of engaging people, and I think it's extremely important when we're speaking about low-income neighborhoods. And why does this matter? Well, just as a reminder, we know that we're in a society where inequality is increasing. This is a chart I borrowed from David Olchansky, professor here, who shows what's happened to the share of the top 1% for 6 countries from the 1970s to today. And if you look at these slides, they all go up in 1980. Well, what happened in 1980? Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Brown Mulroney. They all brought in neoconservative policies about cutting taxes, getting rid of government oversight over things like the banks. We know how well that worked. And a number of other neoconservative policies, and the direct result was the rich got richer and the least off got poorer. Now, less true in Canada than the US because of our social programs, particularly Medicare, but still a significant change. And from my perspective, one of the most important roles of government is to ensure that every single resident has real opportunity. That's a Canadian value, it's a societal value, and government is the place that we come together and can actually achieve that. And what had happened since the 1980s is deliberate government policies that had led to the opposite result. The most powerful and the richest were getting richer and more powerful. And so in our efforts in Toronto, we were trying to do the exact opposite, to help those who needed help the most. And one of the ways we did that is through the priority neighborhood strategy, which you're probably aware of, but is relevant to the last 2 points I want to make about how you bring together social justice, jobs, and the environment. We did a study in 2005 with the United Way, the provincial government, the private sector, the academic community, and the federal government to look at poverty and public safety in Toronto. And one of the things we discovered was it was very clear that there were a number of neighborhoods in Toronto where there was a very high correlation between low incomes and a lack of public investment over time. And they became priority neighborhoods because they were a priority for investment. And there are some neighborhoods that have significant challenges with income levels, but have good public services, or relatively good, like Regent Park. So it's not a priority neighborhood. These neighborhoods were ones where they had to be a priority for public investment. And the intention was the city, the province, and the federal government would channel their investments to the priority neighborhoods. And the city certainly did, and we had some success with the provincial and federal governments, and the United Way is doing the same thing. And you know the neighborhoods. Jamestown, Jane Finch, Malvern, Steele, Lammer, others. And this is quite relevant to the work we did on environmental initiatives. And I'll speak to a couple. The first is power renewal. Tower renewal is an environmental initiative that was actually developed by engineers and then architects from the University of Toronto. The engineers had the insight that these apartment buildings, which were made out of concrete in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were funded by the federal government as a housing measure because there was a huge housing shortage post-World War II. And they're made out of concrete, they'll be here forever. That's a great thing. And they're actually fairly big units. They're called concrete slab buildings. You see the stripes on them. That's how you know it's a slab of concrete. So they're good housing. They'll be here forever. But the bad news is concrete has no insulating power whatsoever. So these buildings waste energy unbelievably, whether they're heated by gas or electricity or oil. Huge wasters of energy. In fact, it costs more to heat a one-bedroom apartment in one of these buildings than it does a small house, which is counterintuitive. You'd think an apartment would be very energy efficient. It isn't. They're huge, huge wasters of energy. So the engineers at the University of Toronto determined that if you insulate these buildings from the outside by putting aluminum panels and then insulation between the panel and the building, it's called reskinning, you could significantly improve the energy efficiency of the buildings, enough to dramatically lower their energy consumption. And if you insulated all of these buildings in the city of Toronto, there's 1,000 of them, you would lower the greenhouse gases emitted from Toronto by 5%. And the first Kyoto target is 6% reduction by, below 1990 levels. So you could virtually reach the Kyoto target by simply insulating these buildings on the outside. And it pays for itself in about 7 years. That's a fantastic environmental initiative. The architects looked at it and said, you know what? A lot of these buildings are in lower income neighborhoods and the landlords aren't investing in them. They're becoming deteriorated. This is an opportunity to revive neighborhoods physically as well. And they brought it to the city and we looked at it and said, that's great. But you know what people need in priority neighborhoods? What they're telling me is they want jobs and they want opportunity. So we started to work with the trade unions who supply the trade that would work on these kinds of initiatives and in fact would have to train a whole new series of skills in order to train the people who live in the very buildings in order to get the jobs to green the buildings, to lower the cost of running the buildings, which would help lower their rent and help make everything more affordable for them in the city of Toronto. And to give you some perspective on the number of jobs, it's estimated that it takes about 30 people a year to do an energy retrofit on one of these buildings. There's 1,000 buildings, that's 30,000 jobs. And this project's still continuing under the current government. There's 7 buildings they're doing pilots, because again, we're Canadians. When Los Angeles figures this out, they're just going to replace all the buildings in Los Angeles with energy efficient buildings. But there are some technical issues that have to be met and some financing issues, and they're working on those with large landlords, small landlords, and the Toronto Community Housing Company. But a huge opportunity to meet incredibly high environmental standards and create jobs and address inequity and inequality in this city. And the best thing of all is it's economic. Why? You're getting rid of waste. And it's very simple. When you get rid of waste, it's good for the environment. When you get rid of waste, it's good for the economy and business as well. And that's what this initiative is doing. So one more thing I want to speak about, and that's public transit. These, by the way, are the new streetcars, in case you haven't seen them yet. I think they're beautiful. And the new LRTs will be extremely similar. The difference is the streetcars are unidirectional like they are today, and the LRTs there's a cab at both ends, so they can go either direction without having to turn around. And that's Transit City. And I'm sure people are well aware of the debate about transit in Toronto. We had an important perspective on it. I've been commissioner of the TTC, so was quite familiar with what was possible and what wasn't possible, and also a board member of Go Transit. And in the run-up to the 2006 election, I'd asked the TTC to tell me what was possible in the city and what the best method of transportation was to provide a rapid transit network to all neighborhoods. Because from a transportation perspective, Toronto has a great system, but it's a great system for a city of about 1 million. That's what the subway's designed for in the streetcars. You know, we're a city of nearly 3 that's the heart of an urban region of 6. And in that city of 3 million, urban region of 6, what we really have is 2 lines that cross each other. And that's not adequate for a modern Toronto. You need to build a network. And the TTC advised me that given densities, that the appropriate thing to do was a couple of strategic subway enhancements. But for most of the city was to build light rail. And in 2006, I ran on a platform saying we'll build a light rail network. March 2007, Adam Giambroni and the TTC developed Transit City. We announced the plan. It was approved in principle by council in the changes in the air document. And on June 15, 2007, Premier McGuinty announced full funding for this network to be completely built with all of these lines by 2020. So if they're not all built by 2020, Torontonians should be asking some serious questions, because the money was there as of June 15, 2007. And I remember that conversation very clearly, not just because it's a pretty important announcement for Toronto, but because it was my wedding anniversary. And I told Joe when I got elected mayor, that was the one day I would always take off, and we'd always do something, just the two of us. So just the two of us went to a bus garage in Mississauga, along with all the television networks, not quite as many as Bill Clinton, and the Premier. But it was a terrific announcement. 2009, the specific funding for Eglinton, Sheppard, and Finch was announced. Sheppard started construction. Eglinton, the tunnel boring machines were purchased. 2010, sadly, the Premier cancelled funding on Finch, a transit line going through two priority neighborhoods connecting Pearson Airport, Humber College, Rexdale, Jane Finch into the rapid transit network of Toronto. I thought that was shameful, and you know the history post-2010. The good news is it's back on. So why light rail? Why this plan? What does it have to do with social justice, jobs, and the environment? Well, I hope the environmental benefits are obvious. As we want to decarbonize, the more parts of our transportation network we can move to electricity fueled by green sources like hydro, wind, and solar, the better off we are. Transit City is very important because as a network, people are far more likely to get out of their cars and take transit than they are when it's simply a line. And that's why it's important you have the north, south, east, west lines that connect to the network, so that people can get home wherever they happen to be. Secondly, from a transportation perspective, it meets the needs for Toronto for at least the next 75 years, and it also helps to facilitate development on these lines. And that's important because if we don't bring development into Toronto, we're going to continue to experience sprawl. And sprawl has huge negative local and larger environmental consequences. It's paving over farmland, so we have to buy our food from Mexico and California instead of, from half an hour away. It creates a system where you virtually have to drive. Sprawl-based, it's very difficult to overlay transit. A number of other consequences. So extremely important for Toronto and the official plan to encourage density on these lines. So that's important. So there's an economic aspect, because that brings growth to the Toronto economy and creation of jobs. We also created jobs through the way this is going to be built, and through the fact that the cars were all going to be made in Canada. Very important from my perspective, and I know that's not modern political thinking. People are all talking about free trade. Well, it's really important. I think those investments should create jobs here. These cars are built by Bombardier in Thunder Bay, which has supplied all the subway cars in Toronto after the first generation. And all of the current streetcars in Toronto were supplied by that plant. They actually won a bid on this, but we put Canadian content requirements on it. They're also making the subway cars, which was a sole source because they're the only people that make them in Canada. But there's also a really important point about social justice. And this is the point I'll end on, so Frank will make his remarks. When we were out speaking to people about Transit City, and we held well over 70 public meetings along Finch and Sheppard to speak to people, we had extraordinary letters. We had a letter from the Eglinton businesses. We hadn't even started consulting with them, and they wrote and said, please don't ferry this. Please run this at grade, above ground, because our customers want to experience the city. They love Toronto, and we also want them to see our businesses as they drive by. And that's not the popular view sometimes, but people actually love above-ground transit when it's clean, it's efficient, it comes on time, which is very important. That's one of the reasons you're running light rail its own right-of-way. So one person in a car turning left can't hold up 200 people in an LRT. And I was quite encouraged by that. Unfortunately, Eglinton, in the center part of the city, you have to bury it because the road isn't wide enough to have a reserved right-of-way down the middle. But I thought it was quite an interesting letter. In any event, I went out on Shepherd and I rode the bus. And I started north of the Shepherd East line because my assistant Clyde lived there. We started at his house in the morning. I went on one bus, changed on the Shepherd, changed onto the subway, and talked to a woman that I'll call Marjorie. And I said to her, she got on the subway with us, and she'd been on the first bus. 2 buses in the subway. I said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Pearson." And I said, "Why are you going to the airport? You're going on holiday." She said, "No, I work there." And I said, "That's a very long commute." She said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" She said, "Well, I take another subway, then another bus, and another bus, and I get there." So that's 4 buses, 2 subway rides to get to work. And I said, "Wow, that's a long day." And she said, "Yes, but that's only my morning job. I work, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel in the afternoons." And she took 2 buses and a subway to get to the Royal York Hotel, and then the subway, the RT, and a bus to get home. By my estimation, she spent somewhere between 3.5 and 4 hours a day on the bus, and that's if she got her connections. Right, so our buses don't operate in reserved right-of-ways. So when traffic's bad, you get 4 buses and don't get another one for 20 minutes. Right, it's a huge problem that Transit City is trying to correct. Now imagine her life if she had a bit more time. Imagine if she could ride the reserved right-of-way knowing that her transit would come on time or within a minute or so. That she wouldn't have to wait 20 minutes and 4 buses would come. And she'd have fewer connections. And she'd have rapid transit all day to get where she was going. That could give her back an hour and a half every single day. Or what could she do with that? Well, she could be home with her children if she wanted to be. Perhaps if they're a little older, she could do what my mom did and go back to school. My mom graduated when she was 56 from university, which I think is a pretty remarkable achievement for a single mom bringing up an only child. But maybe she could do that. Maybe she could upgrade her skills so she got a full-time job. Maybe she could go to some of the community meetings debating whether to build the Shepherd LRT or to defer it endlessly and build a subway when there was mythical money coming in 50 years and actually speak up. I don't know. But the impact on her life as a low-income person in Toronto, working 2 jobs just to put food on the table, would be tremendous. Transit City isn't the only environmental initiative that creates jobs, creates social justice, and works for our environment. There are many. And the great news from my perspective is they're happening in cities around the world. If we can pull these together and act, we can actually meet our environmental challenges, and we can also create a far more just and equitable society. That's my goal. I'm sure it's shared by you. It's shared by mayors around the world, and I hope we can do it. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, it's lucky we're not in the debate room because I might be expected to debate. But what would I debate? I mean, we're in a quorum, so I couldn't debate what David Miller has to say. And if I can't do that, then I'll do what I'm trained to do, and that is, Professor, I will profess, don't get nervous. It'll be short, and I hope it won't be too didactic. Talking with Igor and some of the other organizers, I thought maybe what I could do would be to bring the perspective of from urban and environmental studies and theory, and that's what I do. I teach environmental theory and I teach urban theory here at the University of Toronto. Bring them to bear on this discussion. Let me begin by reporting a project also in Brazil, this one in Rio. Some years back, I attended a meeting of the World Urban Forum in Rio, and there were a lot of NGOs and citizen groups at that forum. The minority of us were academics, and boy, was it a different conference, and a much better one than the ones I'm used to. One of these groups was a group of women, for the most part, who were garbage pickers, not garbage workers, but they were people who didn't work for the city. They would go and they would pick up garbage from the dumps. And they had organized themselves into a project. And the project was to bring some of the technology, which, as David reported, was already being developed in Sao Paulo at the time, to convert landfill garbage and so on into usable methane, to bring that to Rio, but also, and again, this would be very similar to the tower renewal project that David referred to. The idea is that the people who are now garbage pickers would be trained to operate that technology. And they brought people from different parts of the world to Rio at city government expense to talk about the feasibility. They brought people from other cities, such as Sao Paulo, that were already experimenting with this. Their concern, of course, is you could actually make a decent living picking garbage. You could only do it if you had your children doing it as well. And their concern is for the health of their children. I'm going to return to the significance of that story. It just struck me. It was so much more informative than any of the other speeches that I was hearing at this conference. It stuck with me since. And they're making progress to this day. I'll come back to it later. I thought first I could frame the sorts of issues of social justice and of environmental sustainability against the background of thinking on these key matters. And let's start with environmentalism. In the last century, for most of it, to be an environmentalist was to be in favor of piecemeal conservation. Then, people began discovering the work of pioneers such as Aldo Leopold and others, who said this is the wrong way to think about the environment. The environment has to be thought of as a system, as an ecosystem. Ecosystematicity, nice word, eh? Ecosystematicity began by the 90s, certainly, even in the 80s. Ecosystematicity, thinking about the environment as an integrated whole, became the way that environmentalists started to think. And that affected us here as well. Another environmentalist and visionary mayor, David Crombie, was made the head of a royal commission on the Toronto waterfront. And in the early 90s, they published a report talking about the waterfront. The Royal Commission was surprised by this report. They thought it was going to get into the nitty-gritty of the debates as between the three levels of government over who has control of this or that. That's not what they did. They began by talking about what they considered the Toronto waterfront to be. And they thought that first of all, where is it? Well, it begins north of Toronto at the Oak Ridges Moraine. It goes at least over to Hamilton on the one side, and to Oshawa on the other side, and it comes down to the lake and even into the lake on the south. That's what they thought the Toronto waterfront had to be thought of. And what was in this waterfront? Well, there was water. There were certainly the rivers, the Don and the Humber, and all the other tributaries. But there was also the people who lived in this area. And there was the foliage, and there were the cars, and there was the transit, and there were the buildings, and there were the universities, and so on and so on and so on. It was an ecosystemic way of viewing things. At the same time, there were debates going on in the field of environmental ethics. And here you had a sort of a three-way debate that went on. It got quite acrimonious, as I recall, between, on the one hand, those people who thought that technology would solve environmental problems, technology alone, others who thought that it was really an economic problem, and if you had incentives, either positive incentives with tax breaks or negative incentives also by increased taxes, that would solve the problems. And then against both of those was a school that came to be called the deep ecologists. Arnie Ness was a pioneer in all this. And they thought that all of these things were what they called anthrocentric. They were just, it's for us. The environment is not, we're just part of the environment. The environment is a living thing, and like all living things, has its own life, its own rights, and all the rest of it. And so, a sort of biocentric orientation needed to be taken. And this debate was certainly raging during those years. I taught in the first courses that were taught by, in my department, the philosophy department of environmental ethics at that time. I had to teach myself environmental ethics. None of us knew how to teach it. It came from student pressure. The students demanded courses on the environment. This is citizen engagement from the bottom up, and it worked. It's one of the great achievements of that period of time. So now we have a school of environment here. Its first director, David Stefanovich, was here someplace. I thought I saw her, but she's bolted when I came up to talk. So most wise. So these were the debates. I think we've gone beyond that debate as well. David talked about jobs, the economy, and social justice and the environment, and he was not opposing these things the one to the other. He was showing how you really can have it all ways, and I completely agree with him, and I'll explain shortly why I think that. The second important frame, I guess, that at least I use to think about the environment, especially in an urban setting, is urban studies, the resurgence of urban studies. I'm now, as Igor said, in the city center here at the University of Toronto, and it's, as a city center, it's fairly new, although it has a predecessor in an earlier institution. In urban studies, we see a real thrust on social justice. It comes in two directions. First of all, there are those who see justice as especially important within a city. David already talked about some of the ways that it is. But it's not just a global question, it's not just a national question, it's an urban question, and it's a particularly urban question, because that's where questions of justice, or alas, more often, injustice, strike you every single day. When you are taking transit, you heard that depressing story, or the air that you breathe, the houses that you try to find. Here, the inequities of, the world and the country and the city are especially damaging to urban dwellers, and urban dwellers are now the very large majority of the world's population, and certainly the population of Canada. David Harvey is a pioneer on social justice in the city, which many of you I'm sure have read, and talks about these sorts of things. But then there's another aspect of urban justice, developed around the same time, a little earlier. It harkens a lot of it back to a French social theorist named Henri Lefebvre. And Henri Lefebvre talked about the right to a city. By a right to the city, he meant that every single citizen of a city has a right to participate in the affairs of the city and in the governance of the city. Exactly the kind of, very similar to was it the Green Initiative, the Green Line Initiative that you talked about? I should say that the theme of the conference of the World Urban Forum in Rio de Janeiro that I attended was the right to a city. That was the theme. That was on the posters and all the rest of it. Come visit me in my office. I hope you will. We're at the college in Spadina, an historic place in Toronto. I have that poster. You can come and take a look at it. Some quotes from Henri Lefebvre. Now, I want, against the background of those two frames, as I'm calling them, the environmental studies going beyond piecemeal conservationism into ecosystematicity, and the importance of justice, municipal justice within a city. I want now to come to the question about whether there is an unavoidable trade-off between environmental sustainability and social justice. Can we have it both ways? I don't think, the argument's already been made here tonight, so I don't think I have to go into it in any detail. I think that this debate between the biocentrists, the anthrocentrists, the technological fixed people, I think that we can and have superseded that debate. I think that we are above it, and let me tell you why. There's two aspects to implementing the kinds of measures that will both produce environmental sustainability and also social justice. These aren't the only measures, but here are two as I see it. The first is it feasible? Can it actually happen? Can it be made to work? Well, it seems to me obvious that it can be made to work. This is, why we have such skilled architects and engineers and scientists and transit experts and all the rest, and we've seen some good examples of it. The harnessing of wind power and the capturing of methane gas, tower renewal, all those sorts of things that David was talking about, and many more. The second thing that is required is has to do with public values. There has to be a commitment on the part of the public, the ordinary citizen. There has to be a commitment both to social justice and to an environment and to environmental sustainability. It is not infrequent to hear written in the press by such people as those who were filling that hall you talked about, to hear cynical and pessimistic views about this. And you hear it from politicians too. Well, the public isn't prepared to pay. If it's a choice between jobs and the environment, people will choose jobs, etc. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. What a terrible position to put somebody in. It's a Sophie's Choice type situation. My belief is, my strong belief, is that people today, and the younger, the more true this is, the younger the person that we're talking to, people today already harbor the values favoring social justice and environmental sustainability. They already do harbor. The question for them isn't, should there be, is the environment at risk, or should we do something to sustain it? Is there injustice, and ought we to address it? They already know these things, and they already have value commitments to them. I'm not saying that it's true of 100% of the population, but I think that it's true of enormous proportion, and the majority, they say the younger are more likely to hold these views. The question that confronts them is how to escape the Sophie's Choice, and that's a choice that like Sophie's Choice, the movie where this Gestapo agent made a woman have to choose which of her two children would die. As in Sophie's Choice, this is not a choice that the world has somehow magically created. This is one that actual people and governments give them, force them, like the Gestapo agent. So they want to know how to escape these sorts of things. And so now let me just conclude by coming back to the story of the garbage pickers in Rio. You see, they were taking action. They were avoiding the Sophie's Choice. Were they going to continue to be garbage pickers in the system that they currently had? Or were they going to have new technology and then they would not have the garbage to pick and so they would starve or something? Well, no. You can have it both ways. If they were the ones who were employed to work the new environmentally sustainable technology. How is it that they were able to do this? And this is my concluding idea here. How were they able to do it? Well, they were able to do it because they had the right urban governance institutions and the right leadership in the city. And you need both those things. We've actually had some really good leadership, both in councils, going back at least as far as I know, experience in the city does, and in the mayor's office. David Crombie, I mean, I've already referred to David Miller, referred to Art Eggleton and John Sewell and Barbara Hall, and just picking out some names. Have all of them both wanted to support and defend the environment and also recognize that social justice was a problem in the city, the lack of social justice, and they wanted to work on it. And that's true in the rest of the group of 40 we heard about, and generally. Also, you need the structures. Now, there's a big advantage in Brazil. In the 1988 Constitution of Brazil, cities of 50,000 or more people were mandated to have boards, citizen boards built around different issues. The budget, I mean, heavy-duty ones, the budget, health, the environment, one of them. I think that these women, that they were the activists in Brazil, NGOs that we met, were almost all women, I should say. These women that the garbage picker women that I heard, were part of one of these boards. And I think it fell under health, because it had to do with the health of the, it wasn't the environment, although that's what they were pushing. That was the board they were on. These boards have power. Their analog of councils and their mayors cannot ignore the boards. They must take account of what the boards have to say. It's a lack of structure, but it does seem to work. I think that in Toronto today, what we need is a reform of our governance structure, which means in some cases tweaking it, but significant tweaking. Our community councils are way, way too big. We should be following the model of the borough system, for example, in New York, and they should also have much more power. You see, this is the enabling part. This is the exercising of the right to a city. If we had governing structures in the broad sense of governance, where citizens can be governors as well as governed, if we had structures that made this possible, then we wouldn't have to depend upon electing a mayor like David Crombie or David Miller, although it would be a nice thing to do. The boards, it's a matter of constitution. They must do this. If in addition to that, you've got inspired and visionary and open leadership at the top in council and the mayor's office, so much the better. And then the values that I am persuaded the overwhelming majority of our fellow Torontonians share, the values of social justice and the values of environmental sustainability, would find concrete expression, and the sorts of projects that David already talked about could be multiplied 10, maybe 100-fold. So those are my comments.
Professor Cunningham. We'll be collecting your questions, so people will be joining on the side. Please try your best to keep them concise and they can be answered. And so people will be coming around on the rows, so feel free to provide your questions for David Miller, and then he'll take them up in sequence. Okay?
Okay, there's a couple of questions here, so while people are writing down other ones, Frank and I'll answer the ones these two are directed at me. First one's really interesting. Well, they're both really interesting, but it says, a question to David Miller. What suggestions would you like to give to the developing countries like China and India on how to pursue a sustainable economic growth model? There is a prevailing belief in China that the pollution is the inevitable price to pay for the economic development. Do you think so? And I think whoever wrote this is correct that that's a prevailing belief. And it was true here in Ontario. It was true in Buffalo. People my age will remember Lubkin. People remember. Anyone under the age of 40 remember Lubkin? Basically, it was a chemical dump that the factories just dumped their chemicals in, and really horrible things happened to the health. Horrible diseases happened to people who lived beside it. And it was one of the crises in the 70s that led to some significant environmental legislation. So it's not just China. It's not just India that thinks this way. It's any place that's progressing rapidly. In fact, the reason I found this question particularly interesting was I was at a meeting of mayors, and the mayor of a city in Pakistan, not sure if it was Karachi, but he said that the thing you have to understand, Mayor Miller, is that people in my country see success as having a car and driving into the city just like they do in Los Angeles. And from a transportation perspective, in North America, very few people see that as success anymore, even people who believe that cars should be our only real transportation choice. And that is, it's a real challenge because people in China and India justly want to live economically more successful. So I think what we need to show in the developed world is that there are models that bring together all of these values. And the good thing about China, it gets a lot of criticism for its reliance on coal, and that's appropriate, and they have to do much better. But it's also starting a number of cities that's from the ground up, that are starting out for the highest green principles. And in the last 5-year plan, they had very significant funding, particularly for solar. And there are a whole range of solar innovations coming out of China that are probably going to make it economic in most countries in the world to generate electricity from solar, and things like reskinning buildings. When you did tower renewal, you'll renew them with a solar skin instead of an aluminum skin. So China has a bit of a yin-yang on this. I think it's more complicated in India and Pakistan, but I think if you start in the cities and address social justice concerns while you're addressing environmental concerns, and show concrete specific examples from other cities, you've got a chance of changing that mindset. But some of it is about this belief of what is success. You know, personally, I think a successful city looks like this. That I can get on transit anywhere within the city, rapid transit, and get very quickly in clean modern transit to where I want to go. I think that's my image. But that's something that will take some time, I think, in developing cities to realize. Second question is, for me, do you think a carbon tax like the one implemented in Vancouver is viable for Toronto or Ontario in the near future? I'll answer the immediate political question, and maybe Frank can comment from an academic perspective. But I don't think in the current Toronto government we're going to see a carbon tax. Frank? Okay, he doesn't think so either. I actually think on this issue, more broadly, there's going to be a tipping point very soon. You know, if there's another Sandy or something similar to that, particularly if it hits here in Ontario, people are going to start taking this issue much more seriously, and we'll be able to see more concrete action. The Premier actually went a fair way before sort of resigning on some of those commitments. And I think we should pay close attention to the Liberal leadership and see what comes out over the next few days. People like Kathleen Wynne are very progressive. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that AC, who asked that question, that if events dictate that we may see some dramatic actions, people will demand it. Okay, there's lots of questions. So, Frank, why don't I give you these two? So it's not just me, they're good questions. Maybe the former mayor, but you're the current professor. Okay, to Mr. Miller. I have a project called Skyway, a 4-lane enclosed above-ground highway for bikes and walking. Do you think this can happen? I actually, from a gentleman named George, I really like things at ground level. I think they produce better urban spaces. The space under the Gardner, for example, is very bad. You feel unsafe there. It's not a good space. It disconnects you from the waterfront. If you're north of it, it disconnects you if you're on the waterfront from the core of the city. So it depends a lot on design. It would have to be something that's really see-through in order to meet those urban design criteria, because that matters as well, how you build your infrastructure. Frank, answer a question.
Well, here's one. How can industry/commerce adopt green technology and environmentally friendly policy with green technology being expensive today? The interest in green technology may not be profitable for countries. Well, there's two things to say about this. The first is that it can be profitable. You get into a short-term, long-term situation here, and interestingly, on both sides of it, the companies have an economic incentive to invest in green technology. The small companies who have to look to the short term, but they're the ones who are inhabiting niches. They're the ones who are developing solar panels that you can put on your cottage and that sort of thing. They have an incentive to do this. That's their niche. And the big one in the long run. We see that with some of the auto manufacturers. The Prius and the other hybrid cars that have now followed suit lost a lot. That was a big investment for the first several years. But Toyota was big enough that it could afford to do this. So that's my first point. The second point is that this, again, has to do with questions of governance, now in another sense, also alluded to by David Miller. It's neoliberal thinking that says that it's the private sector that should decide what it invests in and what it doesn't. What happened to government? What happened to government? We don't, it's a myth that we live in a world that is not regulated by government, even when we live under Stephen Harper or people who lived under Reagan or Thatcher. We're not too far from paying taxes time. And those of us who have to pay taxes know that the government is still around. A function of government is to enforce these things, to prescribe them. If I talk to my grandparents, who did when they were alive, and some of you talk to your grandparents and your great-grandparents, you will find out that in their days, corporations could get away with all kinds of terrible things, poisonous food and dangerous automobiles and all the rest of it. But now they can't because there are government regulations. The business people that I've talked to, through an odd twist of fate, I actually was a U of T representative for a few years. Why me? I think it's because I know how to drink scotch. But I actually do think that's the reason. I could go to their receptions, and one of my colleagues felt it easy. Be that as it may, when I talk to some of the people from the Board of Principal big corporations, their concern isn't so much that they don't want to have to invest in green technology. It is that if they're to invest in it, they want their competitors to invest as well. What they're looking for is a level playing field. And that's what government is supposed to be about. So that's that.
So I just have to read a couple of these. The lights. Okay, there's all sorts of great questions. I have them in a random order here. The first one is, what about food? Growing, transport, cooking, eating. C, and I assume this is a book, Grow TO, Urban Agriculture Plan.
It's a document drafted by another player throughout Toronto that's scaling up urban agriculture in Toronto.
So mean, I think part of the answer is to speak to you about that work. But I think food is a critical priority, and I didn't speak to it in my remarks, but we did a fair bit of work, and I think more needs to be done on growing local food in the city. Not just in, I think it's very important to buy local food from outside the city, and it's important politically as well. Because governments, federal and provincial governments can try to divide cities from farmland. And we need to show that the people who work very hard on the farms that supply Toronto, that we support them. It's extremely important. And I think farmers markets have a value there because the direct connection between people who are growing the food and people who are buying it is very important. But I also think there's very significant opportunities to grow food in Toronto. And as you may know, I spend a lot of time in New York at the moment. I'm a fellow at New York University's engineering school called the Polytechnic in Brooklyn. And there's some entrepreneurs there who are building urban greenhouses on roofs and supplying supermarkets in New York City with food grown in New York City. There's only certain things they can grow in those greenhouses, things like lettuce, carrots, and so forth. But it's a huge start. And one of the things about food is there's a significant amount of opportunity for jobs growing it, and to have it be more nutritious if it's grown nearby, and it also tastes better. If anybody's had a tomato from California that's shipped up here green and eaten it, and eaten one locally, they'll know what I mean by that. So I think there's social justice aspects of food, and there's clearly environmental aspects of growing food locally. Do you have another question? I'm going to hold on that. Thanks, come on.
Well, I mean, it's all about public health at the end of the day. I mean, it's partly about just staying alive. But the kind of story that David told, and it's not a unique one. I've found as a teacher that I've had to dramatically reduce the amount of work that I assign to my students. And one of the reasons is that they're holding down a job or sometimes two jobs. And these are full-time students, these are not just part-time students. And another reason is that they will spend an hour or 2 hours or more commuting. That being the case, you simply can't expect them to do a lot of reading, for example. You have to adjust your assignments to take account of it. Well, that's not good for them as students, and it's not good for their physical health either, the carbon emissions and all the rest of it. One of the things we have here at the university, in the medical school, the School of Public Health, it's very active and does a lot of research, and it's being an advocate exactly for these sorts of environmental measures from the standpoint of public health, for sure. I mean, there's yet another motive in another place where you're not faced with a trade-off.
So the next question is, you mentioned, and I assume this is addressed to me, that you do not believe in the free trade principles governing a city's economy. How would you suggest promoting Canadian-made in an equitable and fair manner, avoiding overly nationalistic policy? Obviously, there's a line to be drawn because Canada is a trading nation. But free trade agreements promote a race to the bottom. And they promote it on labor value, and they promote it on the environment. So there's an incentive when you have a free trade agreement with China, for example, for China to burn coal and pollute the atmosphere, bring about much more likelihood of climate change, and pay people less in order to ship goods to us and win by getting a lower price. And I think that dynamic's wrong. So in federal politics, I think people should be arguing for managed trade. There should be labor provisions in our trade agreements. There should be environmental provisions. And we should be saying, we're going to put a duty. If you don't have high environmental standards up to our standards, we're going to put a duty on your goods so that our manufacturers who are using clean power can compete fairly. And I think the question is more oriented at city policies, and I could just, I've got a couple of slides here to illustrate. Yeah. When we rebuilt Regent Park, we talked to the people at Regent Park and listened to them about what they wanted. And one of the things they said they wanted was jobs from the reconstruction of Regent Park. And there's all sorts of goals being met in the Regent Park revitalization, which start from the social justice principle this time, but there are environmental values built in. And from a social justice principle, what we did was work with Toronto Community Housing Company and the winning contractors, and there was a provision put in that 25% of the jobs in the revitalization of Regent Park had to go to people who live there. And this is an area that has significant concentration of people who have low incomes and need full-time work. And these are very good unionized jobs. Now, they had to be trained, and that was the imposition on the contractor. But it's exactly those kind of policies that can produce these sorts of results, and I would call that managed trade. So when we procured for the TTC, the buses, streetcars, and subway cars, as far as is technically possible, are made in Canada. Some of the parts are outsourced because, unfortunately, Buy America policies have meant a lot of the parts suppliers are now in the U.S., but as far as is possible, they're made in Canada. And I think those policies are exactly the right thing to do. It also ensures that jobs are near where people are consuming the goods, which is another important environmental step. Next question is, the Harper administration continues to put Canada in an environmentally unfriendly position despite public support for greener economies. Why is the government continuing such an agenda? Why is no political party being more vocal against the government agenda? Well, the first question, the Harper government had, I think, 39% support of Canadians. And it has a significant amount of support from the oil-producing regions of Canada. I believe the Prime Minister's position on climate change is, yes, it's real, but we're a small country, so we don't make any difference, so who cares? And, you know, I'm going to support the oil-producing regions. I don't want to see any diminution in the amount of bitumen we excavate from Alberta. In fact, we should do it faster. That's his position. 60% of Canadians voted for other parties that have quite clear positions. And I think that's their belief. They believe in small government to begin with. I don't understand, in answer to the second question, why the official opposition and the third party aren't making more of an issue. We saw in the last by-elections, the Green Party did extremely well. They almost won another seat in BC. And these are Canadian values that cut across traditional concepts of right, left, and middle. And you find actual members of the Green Party who are former progressive conservatives, former liberals, and former New Democrats, and people who didn't belong to any party. And I don't understand at all why the parties aren't speaking up. And I can just relate my own experience. When we were in Copenhagen, the Canadian government was attempting in every subtle way to block the negotiations. And there was a lot of media in Copenhagen. And I received an award, jokingly, on behalf of the Canadian government called the Fossil of the Day. And I don't know if people remember this, but they gave it to the Canadian government for being, the worst position in Copenhagen. And I said I was embarrassed to be Canadian. And the Globe and Mail tore a strip off me. They ran a national editorial saying that I was the embarrassment because I said I was embarrassed to be a Canadian in Copenhagen. And then they got a hold of Don Monagus, my director of communications, and said, would Mayor Miller like to do an online exchange of views with Globe and Mail readers about this issue? And, Globe and Mail readers predominantly are people in business. It's a business newspaper. It's a conservative newspaper. Not as conservative as the Post, but it's conservative. And Don said, do it. So I did it from Copenhagen online. And while I was communicating with people, and they're asking me why I said this, they did a poll of Globe readers. 70% of Globe readers agreed with me that they were embarrassed to be Canadians. Now, I wasn't afraid of speaking up anyway. But in that context, and given that Canadians feel this passionately, I really can't understand why the national parties don't speak up. But we have an academic professor here who probably has a better answer than that.
No, because I'm an academic professor, also of political science, I have an answer. I think my hypothesis is, I'm not the only one who holds it, there are the following three reasons why the other parties, the Liberals and the NDP, that primarily means, because the Greens are pretty good on this, we're not speaking up about environmental issues. The first one is that with our political three-party political system, which is first past the post, rather than proportional representation or something like it. With that, there is an incentive for each party to aim at this, what I think is the mythical marginal voter, the undecided voter. And so they will move a baby step to the left or to the right, depending on where they are on the spectrum, to their nearest competitor. The Liberals will be a baby step to the left of the Conservatives, and then the NDP will be a baby step to the left of that, or it reverses in the other direction. And I think that's one of the contributors to it. The second is, I think, has to do with the political party system itself. It encourages, it's politics in the nastiest sense. It's mean-spirited politics. It's hyper-competitive politics. It's the kind of politics that inhibits parties coming to accord with one another. If the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens could ever bloody come to accord on an election, we wouldn't have Stephen Harper-type governments. And in the city, we wouldn't have some of the governments that we had if people not in the party system, but outside of it, were able to come to some kind of accord and agreement. We don't do that. The third reason relates back to structures of governance that I was talking about earlier, and that is that our political system at the federal and provincial level is dominated by political parties. That's where it begins, and that's the middle of it, and that's where it ends. There is insufficient room for effective citizen input, and that includes effective citizen input into the political parties themselves. If you want to have influence politically today, you've got to join one of the parties and put in your time and work really, really hard at it. If your time is not put into party politics, but into social movement, activism, and so on, your voice is not going to be listened to, or not listened to very hard by any of the political parties. So, here's a line.
Well, Professor Cunningham is totally correct on all of that. I just add one thing, because he's completely right about the incrementalism of politics in a three-party system. But what we see amongst right-wing movements, neoliberals, academics call them, I call them neoconservatives, in the United States and Canada, and to some extent in Europe, is what they try to do is motivate their voters by taking really extreme positions. So we see this in the gun debate in the U.S., which is an absolute tragedy, that the positions of the National Rifle Association would be laughable if they weren't causing such tragedy. They're very hard, extreme positions to motivate their people who tend to agree with them to get out and vote. And so for the last 4 years, they called the President of the United States a Muslim, all over the place, which apparently is an insult. So I think we'd find a different view in Canada, but it was amongst certain groups of people in the U.S., it was a motivator to them to get out and vote. Very bizarre thinking, but that's why it happens. And I can't understand why the NDP and the Liberals aren't trying to appeal to their base on these issues and get them motivated to vote, because it's clear that we can do much more in Canada and should do. So that's why I'm puzzled. Okay, I'll try to deal with some of these. A lot of questions here. I'll just go through a couple, Frank, and then get back to you. Why is tower renewal not being implemented despite its obvious advantages? The reason it's at a pilot stage is A, we're Canadian. We want to make sure we've got it right before we do it more, do it everywhere. And B, there's a technical hurdle which they've solved in Australia about private funding. For obscure reasons, private owner of a building, even though it's going to last for 100 years, won't invest in work that gives them a payback over 7 years. They'll only do it if it has 2 or 3. And to get a longer payback, a bank, for example, will want a mortgage. And they don't want to mortgage their buildings because they want to use mortgages for other things like buying new buildings. So you need to develop a financing mechanism that solves that problem. They've done it in Australia, and what they did was it was developed by the mayor of Melbourne, actually, who came to Toronto, saw what we were doing, and said, great, I'm taking it back to Melbourne, and they were already way ahead of us, because they're not going to. And what they did was that the state government, the equivalent of the province, passed a law that said if you privately finance an energy retrofit on a building, the loan stands secured just like property taxes, and you don't have to do any paperwork for it. If there's a default, it's already there just like property taxes are. We've asked for that amendment in Ontario, and if it comes, tower renewal will spread like wildfire. The reason the city's doing pilots, just to be serious, is because the environmental benefits are easy for a private company to get, but we want to get the social benefits as well. We want to make sure the jobs go to the people who live there and have neighborhood revitalization. So that's why the city is shepherding it so carefully. Next question is, Canada's economy is based on extracting raw material. In this economy, no incentive for new technology or green energy. How can we prosper economically facing this dilemma? And it's true, I think we need to create incentives within the extractive industries to green them. And one of the important things in the extractive industries are local environmental issues. And we've really seen that in Alberta around the bitumen deposits. We've seen very serious local environmental issues as well as threats of climate change. And in Alberta, they've created this new company that's supposed to take all the new technologies and develop them, but the oil companies see them as competitive advantage, and they don't want to give them up. And I think the government would have a huge role there to play in both regulating properly. If there was a carbon tax, the companies would start to do it themselves, and it would make a big difference. If there was a cap and trade system, there would make a big difference. But I think, if we created a system whereby these technologies had to be shared, it would also make a very big difference. And it can apply to other extractive industries. I know a mine in northern Ontario that's being re-explored at the moment that is an old mine, formerly owned by Stelco, that they stopped using. So to search for new iron ore, the company, it's called Northern Iron, is going back to this old mine and essentially reusing it. And one of the good news parts about that is if there was environmental damage, most of it will be done already. The extractive methods today are much better. And the infrastructure is already there. Like there's a hydro plant located in Ear Falls, nearby the mine. It was originally built to supply the mine, so it can be supplied by green energy. And I think we have to really get advanced in our thinking. The final point on that is I would say extractive industries are an important part of Canada's economy, but our economy is much, much more than that. There are many, many industries that rely on applied thinking to create thousands and thousands of jobs, and I think we need to think of ourselves in a more sophisticated way than simply hewers of wood and drawers of water. Next one for me, and then I'll let Frank. How can social media be leveraged to greenstream, i.e. mainstream green? That is a great question. And although I use Twitter, I don't pretend to be an expert on social media. So the social media guru who wrote this question, I'll take your advice. So, and I do think it's really important, in our efforts through listening to Toronto and through Live Green Toronto, speaking directly to people mattered tremendously. People in every neighborhood in the city, low income and high income, are really interested in environmental issues. And if you can reach them through social media, I think it's terrific. Exactly how you do that, I'll leave to an expert. Have you approached rich neighborhoods to change their energy consumption? Yes. Are renewables really beneficial for greenhouse gases when most of Ontario's electricity is generated from hydro and nuclear? Solar and wind are relatively expensive and sometimes unreliable. Now, this is a really interesting issue, I think. The nuclear industry has done a really good job at demonizing wind, and there's another question here about people protesting at Maple Leaf Gardens tomorrow about wind turbines. The facts are on the nuclear industry in Ontario that it does have low carbon emissions, obviously. But it also bankrupted Ontario Hydro and almost bankrupted the province because the last 2 nuclear plants built were massive financial disasters. So while it's low cost to operate, it's an incredible cost to build, and we still don't know how to store nuclear safely. We're still looking for places to store the nuclear from Darlington. And I think that is a significant concern environmentally, but you don't have to get there because it's so expensive that we shouldn't be using it. And yes, it is true that wind right now is not cost competitive. However, there's a really important point in this that people sometimes miss. I was campaigning for mayor when the lights went out in 2003, August 15th. I'll never forget that because the first thing was we didn't hear anything from City Hall at the time for about 3 hours. And people didn't know for an hour or two that it was all over North America. And it was really dramatic. And why did the lights go out in Toronto? The lights went out in Toronto because a switch blew in Cleveland that a privatized utility that was making a profit by cutting back on maintenance. Outside Cleveland, our lights went out. And that's the old style of electricity grid, where you build huge plants and ship electricity an incredibly long way. Well, the other way of thinking about it is through Live Green, or through the Power to Live Green, our energy strategy in Toronto. Actually, I won't bother going there. And that is to have distributed energy generated locally. In Toronto today, all of our electricity comes through 2 lines into the city. So if either one of those lines goes down, we're in tremendous trouble. Toronto is the heart of the Canadian economy. 1 in 4 jobs in all of Canada are within about an hour's drive or 2 hours drive from Toronto City Hall. So if our electricity system goes out, the Canadian economy is in trouble. It's that important. And a system where you have distributed energy is far more resilient than one where you have big plants that ship energy a long way. Plus, it doesn't waste electricity shipping it for a long way because there's a loss on the lines. So I think when you add up all those factors, wind becomes far more cost competitive. And there's other things we can do, and energy storage is coming as well. So I would tend to disagree with the premise of that question. So I'll take one more. Sorry, there's lots and lots and lots of questions here. Okay, so I will answer one more because I've got a really simple answer. What is the hydrogen economy's possibilities? What are the hydrogen economy's possibilities in your opinion? And my answer to that is, I don't know. I think my friend, who's an engineer, tells me that fuel cells have a tremendous possibility, but we should be using ammonia, not hydrogen. I'm not an engineer. I can only give you his advice, but he's staking his whole future on it, working for one of the multinational car companies, and he believes there's massive potential for fuel cells to help dramatically lower the amount of gasoline that's used, and particularly the amount of diesel that's used in long-distance trucking. And he thinks hydrogen is too difficult a compound. But I've only spoken to one engineer. I'm a former elected official and a lawyer, not an engineer, so I regret that my answer to that can't be better, and I really appreciate your patience. Thank you very much.
And on that note, I would like to thank, on behalf of the Hart House Social Justice Committee, our speakers, David Miller and Frank Cunningham, for a wonderful presentation from this as well. Everyone is invited for refreshments in the East Common Room. I assume you're very hungry, so take advantage of that, and we'll see you there. Okay? Thank you very much.